Welcome to the U.S. food system, a video presentation for AAE 320, Farming Systems Management, my course here at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. My name is Paul Mitchell. I'm a professor here in the Department of Agriculture and Applied Economics. The learning goals for this presentation, or this section of the course, is to learn about the major parts of the U.S. food system and the flows of good and information through that system, particularly focusing in on where farms fit into the U.S. food system. That's the focus of my course, Farming Systems Management. Also, in class lecture, we'll discuss some of the local examples of companies and organizations that make up these various parts here, and particularly focusing in on the employment opportunities for ABM and AAE majors, as well as others here in the College of Ag and Life Sciences. I also want to become aware, for students to become aware of the uniqueness of farms as part of this system, and to understand some of the context for the topics covered here in AAE 320 and in the overall curriculum for ABM and AAE. The primary sources for this presentation are going to be, first of all, my experiences as a professional agricultural economist here at the University of Wisconsin, but also a nice presentation, a nice publication I found, a framework for assessing the effects of the food system. It's a National Academy of Science publication, but particularly focusing in on Chapter 2, the U.S. food system. And there's a subsection called Defining and Mapping the Current Food System. Many of the figures in my discussion are based off of that section. And it's about 15 pages in full document with the links there in the presentation here. This is a figure from that publication, and it's a conceptual model of the U.S. food system supply chain. And it starts over here on the top left with the farm's input supply, goes down to farm production, you go to first line handlers and manufacturers, to wholesale logistics, then a variety of retailers or retail type organizations, the food and beverage services like restaurants, institutional buyers like hospitals or schools like we're here at the University of Wisconsin, retail food stores, grocery stores, and then food banks, and then finally the consumer. The blue is the flow of goods, food, and services, such as food preparation and food manufacturing, and the pink or orangey red line is money and information flowing back, opposite direction from the consumer back to the various sectors within the food supply chain. The last part here you want to notice is some of the dotted lines for some of the more informal direct to consumer, from the farmer all the way to the consumer. It gives you a sense of the various players in the system. Looking at it in a different way, this is the flow of food only. Start off with crop production on the top left and the whole left side there. And then we have flows into animal production, exports and imports out of that systems, and then into food processing, handling. And finally, on the far right is the edible food, the things we eat. So you can see under crop production now, all these numbers are for billions of pounds. And so you can see corn and feed grains, primarily sorghum, are generating a huge billions of pounds of food here in the U.S. Soybeans is the other part. You add in some other small grains like oats and barley, rye. These are things we traditionally don't eat directly. That adds up to almost 1,000 billion, 1 trillion pounds of food. You add in the small grains like wheat, rice, and then fruits and vegetables. You can see it's a lot of food or raw products for food. Animal feed, so it's a little over 1 trillion pounds, 1,000 billion. About 40% of that goes into animal feed, directly into animal production. Red meat, poultry, eggs, and dairy. And you can see that's about 40% goes to that. And that 40% or 400 billion pounds roughly makes about 150 billion pounds of animal production. Both that crop production and that food or animal production goes into the food processing and handling sector. We called it the first handlers, the manufacturers, and the distributors and retailers. Some of it's exported out the bottom there, but finally on the far right, you get all the various types of food that we actually eat. Processed vegetables, the canned green beans and sweet corn and peas and such. Dairy products, think of cheese as well as milk, obviously. We have fresh vegetables. We have wheat flour, processed and fresh fruit. We got various types of red meat, beef and pork. Wisconsin's big in beef, and think of bratwurst and other sausages. We got our various vegetable fats, or soybean oil and such, or poultry, sugar and corn sweetener, eggs and rice, fish and seafood, oats, animal fats, lard is probably the biggest one there, but it goes down the list there. And then you can see there's some waste as well. But it gives you a sense of the overall flow and where crop and animal production fit in, and how it flows through that system. Next, we want to look at the next figure here from the Nisha et al. Report. It shows where consumers spend their money and where they eat their calories. The figure, the bar on the left is the percentage of total food expenditures, where we spend our money, and the one on the right is the percentage of our calories consumed. You can see roughly half of our spending is at food at home. And then you go up to a little over a third is at restaurants. And then the top two are other places like schools, and then other places. I'm thinking hospitals and like quick trips and such like that. They're not restaurants, but they're not, you eat them food away from home. The last one is where our calories come from, though. Even though about half our spending is food at home, about over 2/3 of our calories are consumed at home, whereas only 20% of our calories are coming away from home at restaurants. You can see there's a lot of expenditures over here on the left, but not as many calories. Our calories are primarily coming at home. Here's a good example of some, gives you a sense of what we eat. And this is from the National Geographic based off of UN data. This is for 2011, so it's a little dated, but I'm sure things have shifted a little bit. Maybe post-COVID, they'll update this. But it compares what we eat in the US to the world average. You can go to the webpage link there, and you look at other countries that they list. You can also break down these categories into specifics. But what you'll see quickly is the US, 37% of our calories are coming from sugars and fats, 22% from grains, and then you can look at red meat, and eggs and dairy are very large. And then we've got produce, both fruits and vegetables, and then this other category, which is primarily pulses and alcohol, are probably the two biggest components. In the middle there, it shows the number of calories. About 3,600 calories is sort of the typical US average in 2011. Now let's look at the world. The number of calories drop quite a bit to 2,870. So, quite a few more calories are consumed here in the US. But then you can see the shares there. Where do their calories come from? Primarily from grains. 45% of the calories coming from grains. This would be things like, wheat, obviously, but rice is a big one in the world. Sugar and fat is only 20%, still a large component, but not as much as in the US. And then you go through the produce, a little higher in the US, and then dairy and eggs and meat are lower than the US. And the other is roughly the same in both the US average and the world average. So it's a great place to explore and kind of get a sense of how diets vary across countries, and as well as the total calories consumed in each country. Now we're going to go back, instead of looking at the consumer end, we're going to go back to the very beginning of the supply chain, the input purchasing. I wanted you to get a sense of, we're going to go quickly through the supply chain here on the input end, focusing on, first off, what people are buying, or farmers are buying particularly. What you see, this is US, $358 billion worth of farm inputs were purchased in 2019. Feed was a big one. This is going to be livestock feed primarily, corn and soybeans, alfalfa hay and things like that used for feed for cattle and hogs and poultry. Farm services are going to be things like veterinary services, as well as marketing services and insurance and things like that. Labor is a big one, obviously. Supplies and repairs and construction of the buildings that farmers maintain and repair. Fertilizers and chemicals are also important. And that's going to be, I think of ABM majors pretty commonly end up selling feed, seed, and chemical. Well, feed, as we saw, is a large one, as well as fertilizer and chemical. Machinery and vehicles, another big one. We have a lot of people end up in machinery sales. Interest, taxes, and miscellaneous capital expenses. That's our ag lending, as well as taxes, tax preparation. There's our seed at the national level. And then you have livestock and related expenses. And this is a lot of livestock industries. There's people who produce the young livestock, and then they're moved to another location for feeding them out to become full-sized animals for making meat. So I think of, you got feeder cattle, which are young cattle, and then they become fed cattle. Somebody buys feeder cattle from one farmer or operation and feeds it out and becomes fed cattle that is then sold for a slaughter plant to become our meat products. And then the last one is rent. That's another big one. There's a lot of land rent going on out there, as well as facilities rent. Wisconsin shows very similar, the same exact categories. The shares are a little different, but you can kind of see, this is from a slide I did earlier in the class from the second lecture. And this is a comparison of the two. The US is the first column, the Wisconsin's the second column, and I just want to highlight a few differences between the US typical and Wisconsin. What you can kind of see is we have relatively lower fertilizer expenses. I'm looking here at it's quite a bit noticeably lower. I think that's our manure. But our feed expenses are higher. You see that up there. It's our livestock industry. We have more livestock than typical. Our farm services are a little higher as well, and some of the other ones as well. You can go to our labor expenses. We have a lot of dairy. They hire a lot of labor. We have a little bit more supplies, repairs and construction. Again, I'm thinking it's dairy parlors, milk parlor maintenance. But our seeds are a little higher. I'm not sure why. I'm thinking maybe our potato and vegetable industries and our cranberry industries, the seed costs are higher than, say, for other industries. But where we are lower is that livestock and related expenses and rent. I think our livestock is lower because we don't have as much of the farmers buying feeder cattle or feeder pigs or young poultry and then feeding them out. They're using their own. They're going through the whole system. Lower than the national average is the way to think of it. The next one is, where is the value generated? This is from the National Academy report I mentioned at the beginning. What we're going to look at is types of product here. And this is the vertical axis is billions of dollars. And then you got 2005 all the way up to 2012. But you can see the trends is, towards increasing value generated in our food system. But what I want to focus in on is the shares, or the relative magnitude of where that value is generated. The green is the farms. You can see there's quite a bit there. But where the real big value is in the food manufacturing, the big yellow bar there, and then particularly the blue bar. That's the food service and eating and drinking places. And you get a sense of how much of that value the food system generates. A big chunk of it's coming in the post-farm gate activities, in the manufacturing of food, taking raw products from farms and turning them into food, and then the retailing, and particularly the food service, making those foods available directly to consumers. Same kind of idea, but now we're going to look at the sector instead of the type of activity. Is it retail or is it restaurants or is it farm? We're going to look at the sector of the economy, within the food system. You can see there, ag business is very small. I'm thinking that's the input supply. This is the value generated. This is the percentage. And you can see how the shares are fairly steady. There's been some fluctuation over the years from 93 to 2012. But what you see is about 10% of farm production is where the value is generated. Food processing is almost 16%. And you get these other post activities, the packaging, the transportation, and the wholesaling of that food is also an important part of it. Retailers generate about 13% of the value. But the big one is in that food service category. That's going to be not just restaurants, but also think of schools and workplace restaurants. A lot of companies offer food service at their workplaces. And then you get some of these other things. The energy sector, I'm thinking ethanol grew in there. But you can see the finance, banking, and insurance, and then accounting, as well as advertising. Those are all sources of value. But really, where's that value generated by sector? Farmers themselves within that food system are only a small part of it. A big chunk is coming in the retailing and then the food service side, as well as the manufacturing, broken down into its various aspects. So now we're going to go look at that food expenditures. People spend a lot of money on food, but how much of that food dollar, if you will, goes directly to the farmer? You can see the number's been fairly flat. Here's back to 93 all the way up to 2012 again. The average is 17%. It dropped down to about 15 all the way up to 17%. So what that means, for every dollar spent on food in the U.S., roughly 17% goes to farmers. That's split between food away from home and food at home. The food at home, you can see this is the top part of the graph. It's everywhere from mid 20s, say 23%, all the way up to 26%. It's been rising lately. So food at home, more of it goes to the farmer than food away from home, which is down at the bottom, which is almost about 6%. It's been as low as 5 and as high as 10, but it's really flattened out at about 6%. And so that gives you a sense that when you buy food at a restaurant or at a school or some of these places, much less of it is going to the farmer, more of it's going to that retailer or the restaurant or the food service facility. That's you saw that in those previous figures. That kind of makes sense, that most of the money is going in that part of the food supply system, not to the farmer. The stuff you purchase at home, however, and consume at home, much more, almost over a quarter of it goes to the farmer. This is from the National Farmers Union. They make figures like this fairly regularly. This one's very recent. That's why I'm using it. August 3rd, 2020. If you look at the bottom there, follow the link and you can see any newer versions. Really want to look at it. Varies a lot by the type of food we're talking about. These other numbers have been big aggregate numbers. Let's look at specific food items. Start with milk. We're at the dairy state. And they look at the bottom there. Milk is the retail price in August was $3.59 for a gallon. The farmer's portion is $1.56. That's 43.5% goes directly to the farmer. Milk is not processed a lot. It's not retailed a lot. It's generally bought at grocery stores and consumed at home. Sirloin and potatoes are a couple of Wisconsins that got a large beef industry, relatively speaking, within our state. And potatoes are also important in the state. Both of them, the farmer share is about 17.5%. You can see there's quite a bit of less there, but it's still substantial. Beer, we got the Brewers here in the state, our baseball team, but Wisconsin got a long history of beer and other alcoholic beverage production. Very little spending on beer goes to farmers. You look at our pork industry. I grew up in a hog farm, so I'd like to talk about pork, even though it's not a major industry here in the state. We have a lot of, think of like Johnsonville brats and a lot of these meat industries that do make meat products out of pork, even though we don't do a lot of the pork production here in the state. Bacon, I'm thinking Newski's bacon, for example. But you see it's somewhere between 6 to 11% is what the farmer gets. Most of it is down the supply chain, and the other parts of the supply chain is where that money goes. Here's the how is the value generated. It's the same sectors across the bottom here, and this is the vertical axis is the share of the value added. I'm going to focus in on four really big sources of where that value comes from. The blue is labor, salary and benefits, management time, or paying people to run the food supply chain in that sector. The brownish color is capital inputs. That's the machinery and equipment and things like that. The last part, you got taxes and then imports. How much is to be actually imported and let other people, pay the labor and capital costs. I'm going to focus first in on farms here. It's the third from the right. You can see farms, it's almost 3/4 of the value is generated by capital inputs. Think of agriculture, the two big capital inputs. First, of course, is land. You got to have a place to grow the crops or a place to put the animals. The other big one is going to be machinery and other facilities. You need a milking parlor or milking barns, and you have a lot of machinery to grow crops. We'll talk a lot about that in the class, but that makes financial aspects of farm management very important because that's a capital expense. And so that's why we have an ag finance class in the department as part of the curriculum, but you can also see lending activities and understanding farm finance is going to be important. Source of farm income and understanding your how you're making money. Labor is much less important for farms relative to other parts of the food supply chain. Look at those. The other big one, look at like the retail, the food services, transportation, finance and insurance, and et cetera. Those kind of things, a lot of those are very labor intensive. And that's where the money is generated by the workers, the managers, not by the capital inputs. And then you can look at imports or where they're important, like ag businesses. There's a big chunk of their value generated is by imports. We import it and then use that to generate value. I'm thinking ag businesses, a lot of our fertilizer is imported. A lot of fertilizer production is energy intensive, or it's mined from the soil or ground in various parts of the world and brought to the U.S. where it generates value. Another big one is packaging. We must import a lot of our packaging. Energy is another good example, high importance there. And then you can see in the taxes are quite important in the retail side of things, sales taxes, for example, wholesale trade, retail trade, food services. That's where they show up a larger portion there. Now, this is the last figure, and then we'll talk about the discussion questions. And I'd really like to focus on here two things. First is that this green arced bar across the middle. I think that is probably the simplest way to think of the U.S. food system. You got input supply, the farm production, these first handlers and manufacturers of food. Then you got wholesale and logistics, distribution of the food. And then you got the retailers and food services that make it available directly to consumers, and then the people. Food and services flow from the left to the right. Money and demand information flow from the right to the left. And it gives you a sense. I think that's probably the simplest and best way to think of the U.S. food system as opposed to that more complicated diagram at the very beginning I presented. The other part I want to emphasize is the College of Ag and Life Sciences and some of these other supporting structures, the environmental and science and technology systems. Look at that science and technology there. You got farm inputs, food processing, food preparation, transportation, And then on the right there, you got the environmental side: soil, water, climate, plants and animals, and nutrients. The University of Wisconsin College of Ag and Life Sciences, we have farm inputs. We have an agronomy and horticulture department help us understand how to use farm inputs. There's a lot of science and technology there. We have biosystems engineering and food science, both of which have large aspects of them are focused on food manufacturing and making food safe, and developing it to take raw products and make food for it, as well as moving it around and storing it. And then think of we have a soil science department. We have a lot of people who work on water quality issues, irrigation. We have people work on climate. We have a lot of plant pathology, entomology. Those are working with the plants and animals side of things, animal science, animal and dairy science, I should say, and nutrient management. These are all things that we do at the University of Wisconsin. We have, internationally recognized experts here. Look at the social organizations, besides the education, the University of Wisconsin, of course. Think of all the other parts. Social aspects are an important part of agriculture. I think of a lot of various student organizations, as well as the organizations that a lot of agricultural institutions create for themselves, industries do. I'm thinking students probably heard of the Farm Bureau. There's a student branch of that. We got National Farmers Union. And then most of these associations, like the Midwest Food Products Association, is for food manufacturers. We have various meat associations. We have Potato and Vegetable Growers Association. Pick your favorite fresh fruits and vegetables. They all have associations. And that social aspect is very important to agriculture and the food system. And actually, students at the University of Wisconsin is a great place to start participating in those, and develop the skills to work with those organizations. So when you leave campus and are part of the food system, if that's where you go for an employment, you can also learn those skills. The last bottom part, we got two things. We got the policies and the markets. Policy, we're going to spend some time talking about farm policy, the very first one there, focusing heavily on commodity support for crops and for dairy primarily. We aren't going to spend time talking about food and nutrition policy very much, or labor and trade, environmental policy, and health and safety. But you can think about how important some of that stuff is, like food assistance programs, supplemental nutrition assistance program, but you also have all the various environmental programs. And then marketing is huge and important. That's what 322, which a lot of you will take next semester, is about how to market food, but it's very broad. Life science communication works some in this area as well. And we have the students work in marketing. The National Ag Marketing Association has their annual competition, and students participate pretty heavily in that. And it's all very important. Okay, so let's do these last discussion questions, things to think about, and we'll talk about them in lecture. I want you to think about these various parts of the food system and think of specific Wisconsin examples of companies or organizations that operate in each major part of the food system. Which ones operate nationally, internationally, not just here in Wisconsin, and which ones operate over more than one part. Is there value to be captured by doing both input supply and farming, or farming and manufacturing, and things like that? What parts of the system are more consolidated than others, and why do you think this is? Start thinking about some sectors are widely recognized as being highly consolidated. Let's start thinking about that a little bit and why that might be, what kind of factors drive that, and then we'll also think about how does that impact farmers, as well as students wanting to operate the system, or policies. And the last thing I want you to think about is why we focus on farms and agriculture. We have an ag business management degree, an ag and applied econ degree. We talked about the food system. A lot of the value is generated not on the farms. It's huge. It covers many things besides farms. So why do we spend so much time thinking about farms? And so I'd like you to think about those two things. How would the supply chain figure of the food system look different from more traditional industries, non-food, non-farming industries? And can you think of other industries that might have a structure similar to this food system one? What other industries look like this? And we can kind of compare the food system to, say, like our electronic system to generate our smartphones and computers or things like that. How are these systems different? And does it explain maybe why we have a whole college of agriculture and life sciences? Or is it just a historical remnant of things that used to be important? Thank you.